You are not your past, a gentle Buddhist path to begin again. It begins softly, almost without you noticing, like the faint sound of a bell carried by the wind from a distant temple. You wake in the morning, and before your eyes have fully opened, there it is, the familiar weight. Not in your hands, not on your back, but somewhere deeper, somewhere only you can feel. It arrives without invitation, without announcement, slipping quietly into the space between your first breath and your first thought. It is the memory of something you wish had gone differently, words you wish you had not spoken, roads you wish you had walked, years you wish had unfolded another way. It doesn't shout. It doesn't even raise its voice. It doesn't have to, because it has lived here for so long. It knows the shape of your mind like a tenant who never moved out. And so, before your feet touch the ground, you are already walking in a world half made of yesterday. Maybe you don't think of it as a choice. Maybe you believe it is simply who you are now, the sum of your mistakes, the container for your regrets, the shadow of your own story trailing behind you. Somewhere along the way, you signed an invisible contract with yourself, agreeing that you would carry this weight for as long as you live. But here is what I want you to consider, and I ask you to listen closely, not just with your ears, but with the quiet place inside that still believes in beginnings. You are not your past. You are not the weight you carry. You are the vast, open space in which your past arises, and the vast, open space in which it can finally rest. This is not just poetry. It is the truth taught by those who understood the mind long before we named it psychology. The Buddha spoke of it not as an abstract philosophy, but as a lived reality. He taught that clinging, whether to joy or to sorrow, is what binds us to suffering. What you think, you become, he said, and if what you think about is always yesterday, then you are building your home in a place that no longer exists. Life trains us well in the art of remembering. We carry old arguments like folded letters in a pocket, taking them out in the quiet hours to read again, as if more reading could change the ending. We replay scenes, words, choices, not because they are useful now, but because the mind has learned to hold onto them as if they were part of its identity. Psychologists call it rumination. In Buddhism, we simply call it clinging. And clinging is like tying yourself to a boat that has already drifted away from the shore. Sometimes I think of a story from the Zen tradition. Two monks were traveling together and came to a river. A woman stood at the bank, afraid to cross. One of the monks lifted her onto his back, carried her through the water, and set her down safely on the other side. The monks continued walking in silence for hours. At last, the other monk said, "You know we are not supposed to touch women. Why did you carry her?" The first monk replied, "I put her down hours ago. Why are you still carrying her? We all do this. We carry people, moments, mistakes long after they have left the riverbank of our lives. We let them live rent-free in our minds, letting the echo of their presence shape the way we see ourselves today. But the truth is, our past is not happening now. It is memory, not reality. And just for a breath, one breath, you can set it down. Feel the chair beneath you. Notice the air moving in and out. In this moment, nothing from the past is happening. It exists only in the mind's replay, and like a film left running, it will stop the moment you decide not to watch. Impermanence, Anicca, is not just about the way flowers wilt or seasons turn. It is the nature of every thought, every feeling, every story we have ever told ourselves. Even your most unshakable regret is already changing, moment by moment. Like clouds across the sky, it cannot stay exactly as it is. The question is not whether it will move, but whether you will loosen your grip and allow it to. I once met a woman named Maya, well into her 70s, who carried a single memory of guilt for over 50 years. It was the first thing she thought about in the morning and the last thing before sleep. Then, one spring day in a park, she watched children blowing soap bubbles. Each bubble rose, shimmered, and disappeared into the air. And she thought, my guilt is like these bubbles, it doesn't have to stay. From that day on, she made a ritual, one bubble each morning, carrying her guilt into the sky. It didn't erase the past, but it freed her to live in the present. This is what I am inviting you into. A new way of holding your own story, not by erasing it, not by pretending it never happened, but by letting it live where it belongs, in the past. Tonight, when the old memories come, greet them like visitors. Offer them tea, then kindly show them the door. Your life is not a museum for pain. It is a garden. And today you can plant something new. And perhaps the most surprising thing about setting something down is realizing how long you've been carrying it without noticing. Like a heavy bag slung over your shoulder, it becomes so familiar that you stop feeling its weight. You learn to move with it, sleep with it, wake with it, until one day someone says, "You can put that down," and your first thought is disbelief. I didn't even know I was holding it. The Buddha often compared the mind to a field. Seeds of all kinds are constantly falling into it, some from the past, some from the present, some planted by others, and some we plant ourselves. Whatever seeds we water will grow. If we water seeds of anger, regret, or shame, those are the plants that will flourish and crowd out the rest. If we water seeds of kindness, patience, and joy, our inner garden will grow differently. But here is the gentle truth. You cannot plant tomorrow's flowers if your hands are still full of yesterday's weeds. To make space for new life, you must first loosen your grip on the old. And this is not a harsh act. It is not tearing up the weeds in anger. It is the soft, mindful act of letting go, trusting that nature will take care of the rest. I remember an old lay disciple I met years ago in a small village near Chiang Mai. She was in her 80s and had lost her husband, 2 sons, and most of her friends. You might expect her to be bitter, but she radiated a warmth that felt like sunlight after rain. When I asked her how she managed to carry so much loss with such peace, she smiled and said, "I don't carry it. I let the river carry it for me. Every morning when I wash my face, I imagine my grief flowing into the water and the river takes it away." This is not denial. She still remembers her loved ones. She still feels moments of sadness, but she does not invite the past to sit on her chest each morning and press the air from her lungs. She gives it to the current and trusts it will find its own way. Modern life makes this harder. We live in an age where reminders of the past are not only in our minds, but on our screens. Old photos resurfacing without warning, messages from years ago appearing as memories, algorithms that dig into our digital history and feed it back to us. In a strange way, we have built machines that do what the mind already does too well: keep the past alive. That is why the practice of letting go must be conscious. It will not happen by accident. We must choose it again and again, sometimes every hour, sometimes every breath. And each time we choose it, we reclaim a little more of the present. There is a simple meditation I often give to students who are struggling with the weight of old memories. Sit quietly, close your eyes, and picture the memory as an object in your hands. It could be a stone, a box, a folded letter, whatever feels natural. See its shape, feel its weight, notice its texture. Then on the next exhale, imagine placing it on the ground in front of you. You are not throwing it away, you are simply setting it down. Rest your hands in your lap and feel the lightness. Stay there for a few breaths, and if the memory returns, as it often will, repeat the practice. Each time you do, the weight becomes a little less, the space a little more, because letting go is not a one-time event. It is a way of living. The river does not flow only once, it flows always. And the more you trust it, the more you realize that nothing you release is ever truly lost. It is simply transformed, like rain becoming mist, or autumn leaves becoming soil for spring. When we begin to see the past for what it truly is, a shadow cast by something no longer standing, we can start to loosen the way it clings to us. The Buddha once said, "Just as a snake sheds its skin, we must shed our past over and over again." He did not mean that we erase our memories, but that we stop wrapping ourselves in them as if they are the only clothes we own. I once met a man in California, a retired schoolteacher named Daniel, who carried with him a mistake he made 40 years earlier. As a young teacher, he had scolded a shy boy in front of the entire class, not realizing the boy's mother had just passed away. The boy left school that day and never returned. Daniel never heard from him again. For decades, he replayed that moment every night before bed. The boy's hurt face burned into his mind. He told me, "It was my worst moment as a teacher and I can't undo it." I listened and then asked, "In the 40 years since, have you been a better teacher because of that moment?" His eyes filled with tears. "Yes," he said, "I never humiliated a student again. I learned to see the pain behind their silence." I smiled and told him, "Then that moment has already been transformed. You carried it like a stone, but all along it was a seed." We forget that mistakes, when held with awareness, can become the very soil in which compassion grows. In the Buddhist way of seeing, nothing is entirely wasted. Even suffering can become a doorway if we have the courage to walk through it. The challenge is that we are so often tangled in the habit of self-punishment that we do not give the seed a chance to grow. We water only the weed of regret, never noticing that something else is trying to sprout beside it. And so our practice becomes not only about letting go of the past, but also about letting in the possibility of change. This is why in many monasteries, monks begin each day with the recitation, "As the day begins, so may I begin again. As the sun rises, so may my heart rise again." It is a reminder that each dawn is not just a continuation of yesterday, but a chance to live differently. You cannot step into the same river twice, not because the river changes, but because you are changing too. I remember a nun I met in a monastery outside of Kyoto. She told me she had once been a successful corporate lawyer, wealthy, respected, and always busy. But after a serious illness, she realized she had been living entirely in the shadow of her past ambitions. She left everything behind to take vows. For the first 2 years, she told me, I would dream of my old life every night. In the mornings, I felt as if I had lost something precious. Then one day I woke and realized that the dreams were fading. I was no longer mourning my past, I was simply living my present. Her story taught me something profound. Letting go is rarely a sudden act. More often, it is like ice melting, slow, drop by drop, until one day you notice the water flowing freely. And in that flow, life feels lighter, more spacious, more awake. The Buddha never promised that this process would be without effort. But he did promise that it leads to freedom. And freedom, in the truest sense, is not the absence of the past. It is the presence of the present. It is the ability to sit under the shade of a tree without wondering how long it will stand, to hear the laughter of a child without thinking of the years already gone, to hold a friend's hand without remembering the hands that once let go. This is why I say, and will keep saying, you are not your past. You are the awareness in which the past appears and disappears, the witness that remains when the stories fade. And when you begin to live from that awareness, the weight you've been carrying for years begins to feel less like a burden and more like a teacher. There is an old teaching in the Buddhist tradition about a man shot with an arrow. The Buddha asked, if a man is shot and before removing the arrow he insists on knowing who made it, what wood the shaft is carved from and what feathers are on it, will he survive? Of course not. The wound must be treated first. In the same way, when the pain of the past pierces us, our instinct is often to analyze it endlessly. Why did this happen? Who is to blame? What could I have done differently? We think that if we understand enough, the pain will leave. But understanding alone does not remove the arrow. We must first tend to the wound. Tending to the wound of the past does not mean denying what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It means creating a safe space in the present moment where the hurt is no longer in control. It means breathing deeply enough that the body feels anchored here, not adrift in yesterday. It means speaking to ourselves with the gentleness we wish someone had spoken to us with when it all happened. I once knew an elderly man named Samuel, a widower in his late 70s. He had lived through wars, business failures, and the death of his only child. He told me he carried the memory of his daughter's death every day as if it were a stone in his chest. Some mornings, he said, it is so heavy I can barely stand. One winter I visited him and noticed something had changed. There was a lightness in his voice I had never heard before. He told me that one morning he went to the cemetery, brushed the snow from her headstone and said aloud, "You can rest now, and so can I." That night, for the first time in years, he slept through until dawn. He hadn't erased his grief. Grief is not something we erase. But he had finally set the stone down. In doing so, he discovered what Buddhists call upekkha, equanimity, the ability to hold joy and sorrow in the same hand without being crushed by either. It is tempting to believe that letting go means forgetting, but that is not the Buddhist way. Forgetting erases, letting go transforms. In the Jataka tales, which tell of the Buddha's many lifetimes, there is a story of him as a wise deer who saves a hunter from drowning. Later, that same hunter betrays the deer to save himself. In the end, the deer still forgives him, not because the betrayal was forgotten, but because the deer understood the nature of fear and the way it drives people to harm one another. Forgiveness in Buddhism is not a denial of harm. It is the release of the desire to keep holding that harm close to your heart. We can learn from this. Some of us keep old betrayals in our pockets like sharp stones, touching them again and again to remember the pain. We think this will keep us safe from future hurt, but it only keeps the wound fresh. The deer in the Jataka tale chose instead to let the stone fall into the river, where the current could carry it away. That is the choice we are invited to make, again and again. You see, the mind will try to convince you that the past is solid, like a brick wall you can't move. But the truth is, it is more like mist. It seems dense until you walk through it. The wall is not the past itself. The wall is the story we tell about it, and stories, unlike bricks, can be rewritten. There is a practice I give to older students who come to me burdened by decades of regrets. I ask them to imagine their life as a book. The first chapters are already written. You cannot change the words, but you are still holding the pen. The page before you is blank. What will you write? Some laugh and say, "It's too late for me." But then I remind them of something a monk once told me when I was young. The tree does not measure its worth by how many leaves have already fallen, but by how many it can still grow. And so the invitation remains the same. Put the arrow down, set the stone aside, loosen your grip on the story that hurts you. Not because the past never happened, but because you deserve to live in the only place life is possible, here in this breath now. I have met many people who believe that they cannot change because the past has already carved their shape, like a river that has etched its path into the stone. But even rivers shift. Over time, the course bends, the banks crumble, new channels are formed. The same is true for us. No matter how long we have been walking a certain way, the next step can turn toward a new path. There was a woman named Helen who once came to a meditation retreat I led in Oregon. She was in her early 80s, her back slightly bent, her voice gentle but hesitant. On the second day, during our walking meditation, she pulled me aside and said, "I have never forgiven myself for the way I treated my younger brother when we were children. I was cruel to him. I called him names, I broke his toys, and one day I pushed him so hard he fell and broke his arm. I never said I was sorry. He died young and I never had the chance." As she spoke, her hands trembled. We sat on a wooden bench, the morning fog curling through the pines around us. I asked her, "If your brother were sitting here, what would you say?" She began to cry. "I would tell him I am sorry. I would tell him I was young and didn't understand what I was doing." I said, "Then say it. Say it now, not because he will hear you with his ears, but because saying it will release the weight in your own heart." She closed her eyes and whispered the words. I could see the decades of tension leaving her shoulders. This is something the Buddha understood deeply. The heart does not heal through time alone. It heals through intention. We can carry the same wound for 50 years, but if we do not bring awareness and compassion to it, it will remain raw. Yet if we turn toward it with gentleness, even an old wound can soften, the scar becoming a reminder of growth rather than a mark of shame. There is a teaching from the Dhammapada. If with an impure mind a person speaks or acts, suffering follows him as the wheel follows the foot of the ox. If with a pure mind a person speaks or acts, happiness follows him like a shadow that never leaves. The past is not a fixed chain around our ankle. It is the echo of the mind's current state. If we purify the mind here in this breath, the echo changes. But how do we purify the mind when the past feels so heavy? We begin by noticing that the heaviness is not in the past itself, but in the way we keep picking it up. Imagine a bag of stones sitting by the road. You picked it up years ago. You've been carrying it ever since, perhaps forgetting it was even possible to set it down. Purification begins with recognition. Ah, this weight is not me. I can choose to release it. One of my teachers used to say, release does not happen in the mind. It happens in the body first. This is why, in meditation, we start with the breath, the shoulders, the belly, because the body is where the past hides. The jaw tightens from old anger. The chest aches from old grief. The stomach knots from old fear. When we breathe into these places and soften them, the mind follows. The story loosens its grip. In my travels, I once stayed in a small village in Thailand where an elderly monk told me the story of his own youth. He had been a fisherman before ordaining, and one day, in anger, he had struck his younger brother during an argument about money. His brother walked away and never returned. For years he prayed for forgiveness, unsure if his brother was alive. One day, decades later, the brother appeared at the temple gates. Without words, they embraced. The monk told me. In that moment, I realized that the years I had wasted in shame were like clouds hiding the sun. The sun had always been there. The sun, of course, is the mind's natural state, radiant, peaceful, compassionate. The clouds are the past, drifting through. And if we stop clinging to the clouds, the light can touch everything again. So I tell you now, as I told Helen and as the old monk told me, you do not have to wait for the perfect conditions to let go. You do not have to wait for the person to return, or the apology to be accepted, or the mistake to be erased. You can let go because the present moment invites it, because your heart longs for the spaciousness that only comes when you stop carrying what no longer needs to be carried. When we release what we have been carrying, something unexpected happens. The silence that follows can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. We have grown so used to the constant hum of regret, the steady background noise of old stories, that the absence of it feels strange. This is why many people, when they finally let go of one burden, quickly reach for another. The mind, like a hand, wants to grasp something, but here is the secret the Buddha pointed to. You do not need to replace one burden with another. The empty hand is not a loss, it is freedom. This is the moment when the garden of your heart can finally breathe, when the soil can rest and prepare for new seeds. I remember meeting a man named Richard, a retired schoolteacher in Vermont. He had lost his wife in a car accident 20 years earlier. For most of those years, he filled every moment with work, community service, projects around the house, anything to avoid the stillness where grief waited. But one winter, after a fall on the ice left him unable to move easily, he had no choice but to spend long days in a chair by the window. At first, he told me, it was agony. The silence was so loud I thought it would crush me. But over time, he began to watch the snow more closely. He noticed the way each flake landed without resistance, the way the bare branches swayed even in the lightest wind. He began to feel that his grief, too, could rest without being erased, like snow resting gently on the ground. By spring, he found himself planting flowers in the garden again, not to cover the grief, but to give it a softer place to live. This is the difference between suppressing and releasing. Suppression is a dam, holding back the waters until they burst. Release is a river flowing to the sea. The Buddha did not teach us to deny what is in our hearts. He taught us to give it space to move, to change, to find its natural course. There is a parable in the Pali Canon about a man who carried a raft across the land. He had built it to cross a dangerous river, and it had saved his life. But after crossing, instead of leaving the raft on the shore, he hoisted it onto his back and carried it for miles. Eventually, the weight became unbearable. The Buddha used this story to teach that the tools, habits, and even the attachments that once served us can become burdens if we refuse to set them down. In our lives, the raft may be a story we tell ourselves for protection. I will never trust anyone again. I am always the one who gets hurt. I am defined by my mistakes. Perhaps these beliefs helped us once in the immediate storm after a loss or betrayal. But when the river has been crossed, carrying the raft only slows our journey. I think of Anna, a woman who came to one of my workshops in her 60s. She had been divorced for over 30 years but still spoke of her ex-husband with a bitterness so fresh it might have happened yesterday. She admitted that even her grown children avoided the topic because they knew it would stir her anger. When I asked why she held on so tightly, she said, "If I let it go, it will mean he got away with it." I told her the story of the raft. "You crossed that river long ago," I said. but you're still carrying the boat." She was quiet for a long moment, then whispered, "Maybe I don't know how to put it down." We spent the next months working with loving kindness meditation, not for her ex-husband at first, but for herself. Slowly, as she learned to speak to herself with kindness, her grip on the old anger loosened. The raft grew lighter. Eventually, she could speak of the past without her voice tightening, as though she had finally set it down on the shore. Setting something down does not erase what happened. It changes the relationship you have with it. It is like placing an old photograph back into its album. You can look at it if you choose, but it no longer sits in your hand all day. And so, each time we feel the urge to replay the old stories, we can pause and ask, "Is this the raft I'm still carrying? Has the river already been crossed?" That single moment of awareness can be the beginning of release. Sometimes, the hardest part is not putting the raft down, but trusting that the ground beneath you will hold when you do. For many of us, our old pains have been like a strange kind of anchor, heavy, yes, but familiar. Letting go can feel like stepping into an open sky with nothing to cling to. Yet, in truth, what we call nothing is the very spaciousness the Buddha spoke of, the boundless field of awareness in which all things arise and pass away. I remember visiting a monastery in Northern California, where a monk named Brother Matthew told me about his years before ordaining. He had been a firefighter, carrying not just the weight of his gear, but the memories of the people he could not save. "Every siren in town felt like my fault," he said. "Every fire was my failure." For years after retiring, he still woke at night, smelling smoke that wasn't there, hearing voices that belonged to the past. One evening, during a walking meditation by the monastery's lotus pond, he told me about the moment everything began to shift. "I was standing here," he said, pointing to a smooth stone path by the water, "and I realized that I was holding on to those lives like I was their keeper, but I wasn't. My job had been to show up, to try, to give everything I had. The rest was never mine to control." This is a truth the Buddha repeated often. We are responsible for the intentions we bring and the actions we take, but not for controlling the results. Suffering multiplies when we believe the outcome must be as we wish. Brother Matthew began to offer a simple prayer each night. "May all beings I have known and all beings I have failed be free from suffering. May I forgive myself for not being more than I am." Over time, the phantom smoke began to clear. There is a quiet dignity in accepting that we cannot rewrite yesterday's script. Our power lies in how we meet today's stage. If we bring kindness, we plant seeds that will bloom in seasons we may never see, but bloom they will. In the old stories, there is a tale of a woman named Patakara who lived during the Buddha's time. She suffered unbearable loss, her husband, her children, her parents, all within a short time. Consumed by grief, she wandered the streets, her mind unraveling. When she encountered the Buddha, he did not try to explain her suffering away. Instead, he asked her to fetch water for him. When she brought it, he said, "As rivers flow to the ocean, so too does life flow toward its end. The wise do not cling to what must pass." In hearing these words, something in Patakara's mind loosened. She ordained, practiced diligently, and became one of the great female arahants of the time. Her story is not about erasing grief, but about allowing it to take its place in the vastness of life. She carried her memories differently, not as chains around her ankles, but as stones placed gently on an altar, honored and then left in peace. I have seen this transformation in many people. When grief is honored instead of hidden, when mistakes are acknowledged instead of denied, the heart becomes like a house with open windows. Fresh air can enter, light can move through, and the past, though it may still sit in the corner, no longer takes up the whole room. One man I knew, a jazz musician named Charles, once told me that music taught him more about impermanence than any book could. "You can't hold a note forever," he said. "You let it ring, you let it fade, and then you play the next one. That's what makes the song." Life is the same. If we refuse to let a note end, we cannot hear the beauty of what comes next. So, when the mind begins its familiar walk down the corridors of old memory, we can pause and listen for the next note. It may be quiet at first, a moment of gratitude, a small act of kindness, the breath moving gently in and out. And that note, humble as it is, may be the one that changes the song entirely. When we truly begin to see the nature of holding on, we start to notice how subtle it can be. It is not always the obvious pain, the dramatic heartbreak, or the loud regrets that weigh us down. Sometimes it is the quiet, half-forgotten stories we carry in the folds of our hearts. A passing remark from decades ago, a dream we abandoned without telling anyone, a small shame we never voiced. They lie there like smooth stones at the bottom of a clear pond, invisible unless the water is still. That stillness is both a gift and a challenge. Many people avoid meditation because they fear what will rise to the surface. But the Buddha's way is not to stir the pond just to hide the stones again. It is to let the water clear until we can see exactly what lies beneath, and then, with compassion, decide which stones to lift and which to leave. I once sat with an elderly woman named Ruth in a hospice room, sunlight spilling across her quilt. She told me about a friendship from her youth that ended over something so small she could no longer remember the details, only the ache of loss. "We were young and proud," she said. And then 50 years passed. She had carried that ache like a locket around her neck, opening it from time to time to replay the face of the friend she had lost. As we talked, I asked her, "If she were here now, what would you say?" Ruth smiled faintly. "I'd say I'm sorry we wasted all that time." I invited her to close her eyes and imagine speaking those words directly to her friend. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but her shoulders softened. "It feels lighter," she whispered. "Even if she never hears me, I think I've put it down." This is the miracle of release. It does not require the other person's permission. Forgiveness, in the Buddhist sense, is not about excusing or condoning harm. It is about freeing ourselves from the endless cycle of carrying what has already passed. It is an act of kindness toward the self, and by extension, toward all beings we meet from that moment on. There is an old teaching that says holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned. But the same is true for guilt, shame, and regret. When we cradle them too long, they scorch the heart. Putting them down is not weakness. It is wisdom. I think of a man named Samuel who came to one of my retreats. He had spent decades feeling he had failed his father by not taking over the family business. His father had never said it outright, but Samuel had built his whole identity around that silent disapproval. During a walking meditation, he told me, "I keep feeling like I need to go back and fix it, but there's nothing left to fix." I nodded and said, "That's right. The business is gone, and so is your father. The only thing left is the weight you've been carrying, and that you can set down now." We practiced together in silence, focusing on the sensation of the feet touching the earth. "Each step," I told him, "imagine you are placing a brick from that burden on the ground behind you. By the end of the retreat, Samuel said he didn't feel fixed, but he felt freer. And that, in the language of the Dharma, is already a deep liberation. Buddhism offers us many doorways to this freedom: mindfulness, loving kindness, compassion, the contemplation of impermanence. But they all lead to the same open field, the same spaciousness in which the past can be honored without being clung to. We discover that we are not the sum total of everything that has happened to us. We are the awareness in which it all has unfolded and continues to unfold. The past will still knock on our door from time to time. Memories will still come, sometimes uninvited. But with practice, we learn to greet them like travelers passing through an inn. We offer them tea, we listen to their stories, and then we let them continue on their way. We do not chain them to the table, nor do we throw them out into the cold. We simply let them go when it is time. And each time we do, the air in the room feels clearer. The light falls differently on the walls. The garden outside seems greener. We realize that we have been making space, not just for peace, but for life itself to move through us again. The more we practice this art of release, the more we realize that letting go is not a single dramatic event, but a lifelong rhythm, like the tide moving in and out. There will be mornings when the past rushes back like a flood, filling every corner of the mind. And there will be afternoons when it recedes so far you almost forget it was ever there. Both are natural. Both are part of the same ocean. One afternoon, I was teaching a small group in the garden of a temple in Oregon. The air was fragrant with jasmine, and a light breeze stirred the prayer flags above us. A man named David raised his hand and asked, "But what if my past is the only thing that makes me who I am? If I let go of it, won't I lose myself?" I smiled because I had once asked almost the same question to my teacher. He had answered by pointing to a tree in the courtyard. "Do you see that tree?" he asked. "Its rings tell the story of every year it has lived, the dry seasons, the floods, the storms. But the tree is not its rings. It is alive now in this moment, breathing, reaching for the sun. The rings are part of it, yes, but they are not all of it." I shared this with David, and we sat quietly, listening to the leaves move. "If you think you are only your past," I told him, "you will miss the way you are still growing." His eyes softened, and for the rest of the afternoon he seemed lighter. Growth does not erase the rings. It does not pretend the storms never happened. It simply keeps reaching upward, creating new rings, new branches, new leaves. This is what the Buddha meant when he spoke of impermanence not as a loss but as a doorway. The past cannot be undone, but neither can it prevent the present from blooming. I remember visiting a monastery in Thailand where the abbot kept a cracked clay pot on the altar. It was not beautiful in the conventional sense. The glaze was chipped, the handle broken. Yet when the sunlight hit it, the cracks glowed like gold. When I asked why he kept it there, he said, "Because it reminds us that nothing is beyond redemption. Even the broken can hold water. Even the past can hold light." We often think redemption means erasing the cracks, but in the Dharma, redemption means using the cracks to let the light in. When we stop hiding our past, we allow others to see that healing is possible, not by becoming perfect, but by becoming whole. One evening during a silent retreat, I watched an elderly nun named Sister Helen sitting alone in the meditation hall. Her back was straight, her eyes closed, and a faint smile touched her lips. Later, she told me about her life before the monastery, years of addiction, estranged relationships, and deep regret. "For a long time," she said, "I thought I had to destroy my past before I could be worthy of this path. Then one day I realized my past was not an enemy to defeat, but a teacher to bow to. Her words have stayed with me ever since. The past, when met with mindfulness and compassion, becomes like a wise elder who has walked ahead on the road. It will not shield you from every fall, but it can point to the places where the ground is uneven, where the shadows are deep. And sometimes it will simply sit beside you in silence, letting you know you are not alone. When we stop fighting our past, we free our energy to live the present fully. And in living the present fully, we begin to shape a future that will not need to be carried as a burden. This is the quiet revolution the Buddha offered, a way of being in which each breath is fresh, each step is unbound, and each moment is an invitation to begin again. So perhaps tonight, when the mind starts replaying an old story, you can pause and place a hand gently over your heart. Feel the beat beneath your palm. That rhythm is not yesterday's, it is now's. And in that beat, there is a truth deeper than any memory. You are still here, and that is enough. There was a winter evening in Vermont when the snow fell so heavily that the world outside my window disappeared into white. I remember sitting by the fire with a cup of tea, listening to the faint crackle of the logs, and realizing that the snow was doing something the mind rarely manages. It was covering everything equally. The bare branches, the rough ground, the rusted fence, the footprints from earlier in the day, all vanished under the same soft, forgiving blanket. It struck me then. Perhaps this is what compassion feels like when it truly touches our past. It does not choose to cover only the beautiful moments or the easy memories. It covers everything with the same quiet acceptance. The Buddha spoke of compassion as the rain that falls on all fields, the sunlight that touches every leaf without judgment. When we bring that kind of compassion to our own history, even the sharpest moments begin to soften under its weight. I once met a man named Carlos during a community workshop. He had lived a life marked by hardship, years in prison, estrangement from his family, a long battle with addiction. When he spoke about his past, his voice was steady but his eyes were hard, as if daring anyone to challenge him. Over the course of the workshop, we spoke about the practice of metta, loving kindness, and how it could be directed not just toward others but toward oneself. At first, Carlos resisted. "Why should I give kindness to the man I used to be?" he asked. "He ruined my life." I nodded and told him, because without offering kindness to him, you will always be at war with yourself. And wars, even inside the heart, leave nothing but ruins. By the final day, Carlos told me he had tried the practice. Lying in bed the night before, he had whispered to the version of himself from 20 years ago, "May you be safe. May you be free from suffering. May you find peace." He admitted he felt awkward at first, but then something strange happened. He saw, in his mind's eye, that younger man looking back at him with surprise, almost with relief. "That was the first time I didn't hate him," Carlos said quietly. And in that small moment, a door opened. The Buddha often taught that self-compassion is not selfishness. It is the very ground from which compassion for others grows. If we cannot hold our own wounded selves with care, we will always be limited in how deeply we can hold the wounds of another. It is like trying to pour water from an empty vessel. No matter how much we want to help, there is nothing to give unless we have first filled our own cup. There is a parable in the Jataka tales of a traveler who came across a tree bearing sweet fruit. He ate from it and was nourished, and out of gratitude, he decided to stay and care for the tree, watering it, tending its roots, protecting it from harm. In time, the fruit grew even sweeter and the shade even cooler, and many other travelers found rest beneath its branches. So it is with self-compassion. By tending to our own roots, we grow into a shelter for others. But tending to ourselves is not just about soothing the pain, it is also about telling the truth. Some people misunderstand letting go as pretending the hurt never happened. The Buddha never taught denial. He taught seeing things exactly as they are, with neither clinging nor aversion. This means we can acknowledge, yes, that happened. Yes, it hurt me. And yes, I am still here. The mind wants to make the past into a solid object, something fixed and unchangeable. But the Dharma reminds us that even the past is made of moments, and moments are made of conditions that are always shifting. What seemed unbearable decades ago can, under the right conditions, become a source of wisdom. What once defined us can become just one chapter in a much larger story. And when we look back through the eyes of compassion, we sometimes see that the younger self who made mistakes was not malicious, but simply unskilled or afraid or longing for love. That realization alone can dissolve years of self-punishment. We are not excusing harmful actions. We are understanding them in the light of humanity. I remember a dear friend who spent half her life angry at her teenage self for not standing up to an abusive parent. She told me, I should have fought back, but over many conversations, she came to see that the girl she was had been surviving the only way she knew how. When she finally looked at that girl with kindness instead of judgment, she cried for hours. I've been blaming her for not being strong, she said, but she was strong enough to survive. That shift from judgment to compassion is where the chains of the past begin to loosen. And when they loosen, even slightly, we can feel the air of freedom move through the spaces they leave behind. There is a saying in the Dhammapada, hatred is never appeased by hatred. Hatred is only appeased by love. This is an eternal law. When we apply this to ourselves, we see that self-hatred, the constant reliving of past mistakes with blame and shame, can never dissolve by piling on more criticism. Only love, only understanding, can soften its grip. I once knew a woman named Margaret who, well into her 80s, still spoke of a choice she had made in her 20s as if it had happened yesterday. She would recount it to me, almost word for word, the way someone might revisit a crime scene, pointing out all the places she thought she had failed, all the doors she thought she had closed forever. And yet, when I asked her what she would say to a young woman in that same situation now, she answered without hesitation. I'd tell her she did the best she could, and that she was worthy of forgiveness. There was a pause, and then she smiled faintly. I suppose, she said slowly, that young woman was me. That moment was the beginning of her freedom, not because the past had changed, but because her relationship to it had. In Buddhist practice, this turning of the heart is like shifting the light on a stone. The stone itself may remain, but the way it casts shadows changes. Our memories may not disappear, but the suffering attached to them can dissolve when we view them from the ground of compassion rather than the high seat of judgment. Sometimes, this shift comes in an instant. Other times, it unfolds over years. I remember a retreat in the mountains where an elderly monk spoke about his decades-long struggle to forgive himself for a cruel word he had once said to his younger brother. I wanted to erase it, he told us, to pretend it had never happened, but the more I tried to push it away, the heavier it became. Then, one morning, while sweeping the monastery courtyard, he noticed a dead leaf caught in the bristles of the broom. He shook it loose and the wind carried it away. In that moment, he said, I realized I didn't need to destroy my past, I just needed to stop holding it. That image stayed with me, the simple act of loosening the hand. How much of our suffering is just the refusal to open our fingers? It is not that we must never think of the past. The Buddha never said, forget. He said, see clearly. There is a great difference between being trapped in memory and using memory as a source of insight. When we are trapped, the memory is like a cage. When we see clearly, the memory becomes like a well, deep, yes, but also a place from which we can draw water to nourish the present. I met a young man named Elijah who struggled with deep shame over things he had said to his father before his father's death. He carried that shame like a sack of stones on his back. During a walking meditation, I invited him to imagine setting that sack down for just one breath. Not forever, just one breath. Later, he told me that in that single breath, he realized the burden was not the memory itself, but his belief that he must carry it forever. I saw that my father's love was bigger than my words, Elijah said, and that simple seeing was enough to make the sack feel lighter. This is the gift of Buddhist practice. It does not demand that we rewrite the past, only that we meet it with a different heart. It reminds us that impermanence is not a threat but a mercy. Just as the seasons turn and the rivers flow, so too can our relationship with what has been transformed into something more spacious, more forgiving. And when we touch that space, even for a moment, we see that the past, like a bird that once landed on our shoulder, was never meant to be caged. It came, it stayed for a while, it left feathers behind. But the sky above us remains vast, unbroken, waiting for the next flight. I once heard a Tibetan teacher speak of the mind as a clear lake. He said that when we cling to the past, it is as if we keep throwing stones into the water, watching the ripples disturb its surface. The lake does not lose its clarity, but as long as the ripples remain, we cannot see our own reflection clearly. Letting go, he explained, is not about draining the lake or removing its depth. It is about putting down the stones. When we stop throwing those stones, the water settles by itself. And in that stillness, we see not only our own reflection, but also the sky, the clouds, the distant mountains mirrored on its surface. Our mind is no different given space. It naturally returns to clarity. There was a time in my own life when I thought I had moved beyond an old hurt, only to find it resurfacing during a meditation retreat. As I sat in silence, an image from my past arose unbidden, a conversation where I had betrayed a friend's trust. My first impulse was to push it away, to scold myself for still thinking about it. But the more I tried to force it out, the more it returned like a child tugging at a parent's sleeve. Finally, I remembered something my teacher once said. When the mind presents you with a visitor, offer them a seat. So I stopped resisting. I imagined setting out tea for that memory, letting it sit across from me without trying to change it. Slowly, I saw the younger version of myself who had made that choice, fearful, confused, desperate to protect herself. In that moment, the judgment softened. I whispered to her, "I understand why you did it, and I forgive you." It did not erase the past, but it dissolved the tightness around it. That, I learned, is often enough. The Buddha himself lived this truth. In one story, Angulimala, a feared bandit who had killed many, encountered the Buddha on the road. Expecting fear, Angulimala instead saw in the Buddha's eyes a depth of compassion he had never known. That look pierced the darkness he carried, and he dropped his weapons, vowing to follow the path. The past could not be undone, but the present could be transformed. We may not be bandits, but we carry our own weapons, the sharp edges of self-blame, the armor of defensiveness, the heavy shield of regret. And just like Angulimala, we can choose to set them down when we meet compassion face to face, even if that face is our own in the mirror. I think of a woman named Ruth who came to one of my talks years ago. She told me afterward that she had spent decades hating herself for the way her marriage had ended. "I broke something I couldn't fix," she said. But she had also spent those decades volunteering at shelters, raising her children with tenderness, helping neighbors without being asked. I asked her gently, if a stranger told you this story about their one mistake and all the good they had done since, would you see them only through the lens of their mistake? She shook her head. "Then why," I asked, "do you deny yourself the same grace?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she said something I will never forget, because I didn't think I deserved it. And that is where so many of us live, in the gap between the compassion we offer others and the compassion we believe we are worthy of. But here is the truth the Dharma whispers. You are as worthy of compassion as any being who has ever lived. Not because you are flawless, but because you are human. Not because you have never harmed, but because you have the capacity to understand, to learn, to choose again. We live in a culture that often confuses accountability with eternal punishment, but the Buddha's path offers a different vision. We can be fully responsible for our actions and still free ourselves from the prison of self-condemnation. Responsibility looks at the past with honesty. Compassion walks with us into the present. And when these two walk together, we begin to see that the past is not a chain but a thread. We can weave it into the fabric of wisdom, strength, and tenderness that makes up the life we are still creating. There is a small temple I sometimes visit, tucked away on a hill overlooking the sea. The path to it is lined with old pine trees, their branches shaped by decades of wind and salt. One afternoon while I was there, I met an elderly gardener who had been tending the temple grounds for more than 40 years. His face was deeply lined, but his eyes were clear, almost boyish. We spoke for a while, and I asked him what kept him coming back to the same place, doing the same work, year after year. He smiled and pointed to a patch of moss at the base of a stone lantern. "This moss," he said, "will never grow fast, it will never rush, but it will cover the stone completely if you let it. My work is to help it little by little. That is how I live with my past. I do not rip it away. I tend to it until it becomes part of something soft, something whole." His words stayed with me. They reminded me that letting go is not always about sudden release. Sometimes it is about patience, about tending the rough edges of memory until they are softened by time and care. In Buddhism, this is the path of gentle transformation. We often think that liberation must come like a lightning strike, dramatic and absolute. But in truth, it more often comes like dawn, so slowly you hardly notice the light changing until you look around and see the shadows have shifted. I once sat with a man named Robert who had served in the military and carried memories he could barely speak aloud. He told me he feared meditation because the quiet is too loud. In stillness, the past came roaring back. I suggested we walk instead, side by side, saying nothing. After some time, he began pointing out small things, the shape of a cloud, the warmth of sunlight on a fence, the smell of cut grass. Without realizing it, he was training his mind to touch the present, moment by moment, even in the company of his past. Weeks later, he told me that on one walk, a memory had risen, one that used to crush him, and yet it passed more quickly than before. "It's like the past is learning to take shorter visits," he said with a quiet laugh. "This is the fruit of mindfulness, Not the erasure of the past, but the ability to let it pass through without building a home in our hearts. The Buddha once compared the mind to a guest house. Each morning, new guests arrive: joy, sorrow, regret, hope. Some stay for only a few minutes, others linger. But the practice is the same. Greet them all, offer them a seat, and when it's time, let them go. The trouble comes when we insist that certain guests must never leave or that others must never come. This is clinging, and clinging is the root of suffering. I remember hearing an old Zen teacher speak about a jar of honey. If you hold it too tightly, it spills and makes a mess. If you drop it, it shatters. But if you hold it gently, you can enjoy its sweetness. Our past is like that. Hold it too tightly and it becomes sticky and heavy. Reject it completely and we lose the lessons it carries. But hold it gently and it can nourish us without binding us. In my own life, I have seen how even the most painful memories can be transformed into teachers. A mistake that once filled me with shame now reminds me to speak more kindly. A loss that once hollowed me out now helps me sit with others in their grief. This is not because the pain has vanished, but because compassion has entered the room. The great teacher Thich, NH letter 1EA5T, H letter 1EA1NH once said, "The past is not gone. It is stored in every cell of our body, but when we touch it with mindfulness, we transform it." I have come to see this as a kind of alchemy, the turning of lead into gold, of sorrow into wisdom. It is not magic. It is simply the slow, steady work of looking with eyes that no longer condemn. And here is the paradox. The more we practice, the less we feel the need to get rid of the past. We see that it is part of the river of our life. And the river does not need to cut away its earlier waters to flow freely. It carries them forward, blending them into the vastness of the sea. And so, after all these words, all these teachings, one final question remains. What will you do with this moment? Will you continue to carry the weight of the past as if it is your permanent companion? Or will you finally choose to set it down? Let me leave you with a story, one that might change how you see the next moment of your life. Imagine you're standing in a beautiful ancient temple, surrounded by the echoes of centuries of wisdom. You've been carrying an object for years. Maybe it's a memory, maybe it's guilt, maybe it's something that you have convinced yourself defines who you are. You've carried it through the storms of life, and you've built your identity around it. The weight has become part of you, so much so that you've forgotten how to live without it. You stand there holding it, knowing that it no longer serves you, but not sure if you can truly let it go. The weight is familiar. The past is known, but deep within you, you know, there is a lightness that awaits you if you are willing to let go. Now, imagine this. You take a deep breath and in one powerful motion, you place that object down at the temple's doorstep. And as you do, something changes. You don't just feel the weight lifting, you feel the freedom that comes with it. It's as if you have not only set the object down, but also the entire weight of its story. In that moment, you realize you are free. That is the transformative power of letting go, and that freedom is waiting for you right now. But here's the catch. This is not something that can be done in a single moment of revelation. The act of setting down your past, of truly letting go, takes practice. It takes patience. It requires you to be gentle with yourself as you slowly learn to release the burdens that have shaped you. It will come in waves, and each wave will be lighter than the last. This is your path. The path of compassion, the path of understanding, the path of freedom. And it begins with one simple step, realizing that you are not your past. You are not the mistakes you made, nor the grief you carry, nor the regret that weighs you down. You are the space in which all of it passes through, and in that space there is boundless potential to begin again. So, if you've made it this far, take a moment and reflect. What can I let go of today? What part of my past have I been holding on to that no longer serves me? You don't need to have all the answers right now, but start with one thing. One small shift. One act of kindness toward yourself, and that's enough to begin the journey. This video has shared deep insights, stories, and teachings. But remember, the most important lesson is the one you will carry forward. If this resonated with you, if it gave you a spark of clarity, I invite you to take a moment to like this video, comment below with your thoughts, and of course, subscribe to this channel so that we can continue this journey together.